Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of Questions and Almost Answers. My name is Matt, and I'm here with Greg. We are the big pastor and little pastor of Hampton Baptist Church, and we like to talk about what the Bible says. And we love to go over questions that are sometimes overlooked or questions that are difficult. And we like seeing what Scripture says about them so that we can live our lives better, more practically as Christians. And sometimes we could struggle with some of these things and these thoughts, these questions. Greg, what is our outline for today? What questions will we be kind of covering?
Yeah, so there's three questions that are somewhat related. First one is, if God is perfect, why did he murder those people in the Old Testament? And I'm assuming the question is probably referring more to the Canaanite people in the Old Testament. Question two, if he created everything, then doesn't that mean that he created sin? And then question three, didn't God break his own commands by killing people or judging people? I'm assuming that's kind of the idea there, right? So those are the three questions that we'll attempt to answer as best we can.
Yeah, of course. These are quite fascinating. And I think they all fall into a similar line of this God that we see in the Old Testament is is an angry vindicator who doesn't tolerate any kind of shenanigans. He wipes out when there's an issue, and this can be a struggle. Looking at specific portions of the Old Testament or specific verses where these kinds of things occur. And so these kinds of questions, I think, are very reasonable to ask. And I think it's important to give these the time that I think the question should deserve. Uh, yeah. But this first one here, if God is perfect, why did he murder those people in the Old Testament?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of things that we, I guess, got to make sure we're on the same page as to get a good answer for this question. Um, One is the assumption from these questions, and the assumption that's in our society today is that the Old Testament had this mean, angry God, right? And the
Yeah,
New Testament is like the kind, friendly one, right? And
yeah.
so it's almost like there's two different gods. What is interesting is that the original readers and the people who lived in Old Testament times actually saw it the other way. They
Mm,
actually looked at what their experience with God, and it was like, you're too merciful, you're too kind, right?
mm.
Read the Jonah, for example, and like
All right.
Jonah's like furious with God, and actually the prophets are oftentimes furious with God because God is just always being too merciful, right? He says he's going to judge, but then he gives mercy instead. It's like, I'm going to judge you. Oh, here, I'll forgive you, right? And it's that's the kind of God that is actually presented in the Old Testament.
I will
And
sit on
where
my
the
watch post and wait for an answer because what you got to do something about this.
That's right,
Yeah.
exactly. So so yeah, I would argue that the God of the Old Testament is just as kind and good and friendly as what we see in Jesus. I'd say that they are a complete union and unity, right? The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New, it's the same God, the same mercy, same compassion. I will say this, in the Old Testament, there's an intentional tension. Like
Mm,
intentionally, God is saying, I'm a God who is merciful and kind and who loves to forgive sin. That is the first way that God describes himself.
right.
Then he goes on and says, by the way, I judge everyone who sins.
Mm,
So you've got this merciful, loving, forgiving God who also is holy and must judge sin, right? So you got both
okay.
of
Yeah.
them,
At the
right?
same time.
Exactly. And there it creates this tension, right? And it's like, how's this going to play out? And that tension is intentional. You're supposed to feel it as you're going through the Old Testament, because it's not until Jesus comes that that tension is relieved,
It's
and that
resolved.
exactly. So um Jesus is the one who all of God's justice is satisfied with, right? And so now he can forgive us completely, and there can be unity between God and humans. So the person who asked this question and felt the tension, like, God, why are you're judging sin? Like you're dealing with sin. That is right. You
Yeah.
should feel that. Like that is
Yeah.
part of the story. But you should also be struck with how merciful and kind and patient God is, because that's also part of the story, right?
Mm.
So you have to be willing and able to see both of those realities. Here's what oftentimes happens. Um, let's be honest, most people don't ever actually read the Bible. People will go to church their whole life and never read
Mm.
the Bible. People will go to university and they'll sit in front of a professor who says, "Look how nasty God is. Look what he said to do to the Canaanites. He's a God of genocide," right?
Mm.
And they'll quote one or two verses. And in fairness, in most cases, and I'm not trying to be nasty, just being honest here, in most cases, those are the only verses that professor knows.
Right.
Okay. So that professor did not study the Old Testament, doesn't understand the story of the good news of Jesus. They understand a couple verses that was told to them, that was told to their professors. That was, do you see what I mean?
Right.
Where people have not actually evaluated the God of the Old Testament and read the entire story in context.
Mm.
And I understand that, but I don't think it's fair.
Right.
Um, and so yeah, so that's the big picture stuff that um sometimes God is presented as mean and nasty in the Old Testament, but he's also this merciful, forgiving, unbelievably gracious God in the Old Testament. And actually, that's the bulk of the story.
Mm.
The times of judgment, here's what I would check out there. What kind of God would he be? Okay. So in our culture, if somebody murders, they go to prison,
Yeah.
right? If they steal, there's consequences for that, and there needs to be restoration or whatever, right? We all understand there needs to be consequences. What kind of God would God be if he said across the board there was never consequences for any wrongs? What
It'd
kind
be
of judge, what
anarchy.
kind of God would he be?
Yeah.
Right? So then God is in this spot where if he does not judge, then we consider him evil.
Mm.
And if he does judge,
We
then we
consider him
consider him
evil.
evil, right? And God is not put off by our judgment.
Mm.
God is going to be who he is. And he is a God who judges sin, but he's also a God who forgives it.
Mm.
And the way he wants that to be resolved is in Jesus, not in us.
Right.
So he doesn't want it to be resolved by us being judged. He wants it to be resolved in Jesus accepting our judgment, Jesus being our deliverer. And that's how he wants the tension resolved, not in the Canaanites being judged, or you or I or somebody else. Does that make sense?
That does.
All right. So, with that context, let's kind of look at these questions. If God is perfect, why did he murder those people in the Old Testament? So, a very simple answer to this. Um, I don't believe God can murder.
Mm.
Um, so, murder is not just killing. Um, For example, you can hardly walk across your yard without killing something, right? There's poor ants that are now into oblivion because of your walk to the garden, right?
Right.
Like we kill things. It is not sinful to take a walk. It is not sinful uh, for a lion to kill an antelope, right? The killing is a part of this reality at this time. By the way, the Bible teaches that that's only a temporary thing, that God is going to actually do away with death completely,
Entirely.
but that's not for now, right? For now, killing is actually essential. Like you can't survive without killing. Like something has to die in order for you to be sustained.
Mm.
At least a plant, but
Right.
probably some animals too. Like life has to be given for us to live. And by the way, that's a spiritual truth too,
Mm.
that life has to be given to sustain us spiritually. And it is the life of Jesus that is given for us, right? That's why Jesus said that he is the bread of life, right? That he is what gives us spiritual existence. So God cannot murder. If God holds somebody accountable,
Mm.
that is not murder. Let me define murder a little bit, just on a human level. If somebody goes to war, for example, and kills somebody, we don't call it murder, right?
No.
If somebody breaks into your house and is trying to harm you and you defend yourself and they die in the process, that is not considered murder. It is murder when you, out of deep selfishness, you disregard their existence, their
Mm.
life, and you feel that you are so much more valuable than them, that whatever they have or whatever they've done, um, you feel justified in taking their existence, taking their life.
Mm.
That is murder, right?
Right.
It's an extreme act of selfishness that we all understand is immoral and wrong. Okay.
Right.
So we have to look at the evidence for God. Is there any evidence of him acting in extreme selfishness and disregard for the existence of others?
Mm.
And you can't find that, right?
No.
And I would encourage ones that ask this question, or maybe you're just thinking about it for the first time now, like read through what information we have about God in the Bible, and you'll see that God never acts that way.
Mm.
Everything he does is others focused
Yeah.
and for the benefit of others. Um, Both what we see of God in the Old Testament and in the New. The other thing, which this is crucial, right? Okay, so Matt, let's say I don't know, I have a machete, right?
Okay.
Okay, and you tell me, hey, I'm clearing a path out in the woods, maybe
Okay.
behind the Bible camp or something,
Behind the
right?
Bible camp.
And you know I have a machete, and you say,
Cool.
hey, Greg, can I borrow your machete, right? So I can
Yeah. It would make it easier to go and clear the
exactly,
path
right?
behind the Hampton Bible camp.
That's right. So I borrow you or lend you, sorry, the machete, and then you go and you start hacking people up with it. Okay?
Okay.
I'm not okay with that. That's not
Rightfully so, I think,
right.
actually. Yeah.
That's not what that machete was meant for. That's not
No.
why I gave it to you, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so because I care, I'm going to take that machete from you, right? And probably call
Yeah.
the cops. Probably call the
Yes.
cops first, right? But
Rightfully so. Yeah.
right, I'm taking that machete, okay? It's mine, and that's not how it's meant to be used. Here's the big thing, huge thing. Life is God's.
Mm.
God is the living God. The only reason why you and I have existence is because God wills it,
Right.
right? And he gives that life to us as a gift to be used for his kingdom, his purposes, and all of that stuff. And if I take that gift of life that he has entrusted me with, and now I'm using it to kill other people, to be violent, to be awful, to degrade human life,
Mm.
does God have the right to say, okay, that life I lent you, I want it back?
Right.
Right? Does he have the right? And does he even have the responsibility to do
Mm.
that at times in the most extreme examples? And I would say yes, right?
Well,
That
you
is
look at the
not
flood, the flood being one of the largest examples of this.
right.
In Genesis, it describes the
Every thought,
brutality and
yeah,
the violence.
yeah.
There was no redeeming of it was just evil, pure evil. And God
And God's
took the
standards
machete
are
away.
actually right. And God's standards are actually pretty low on this. Okay.
Mm,
So in the Genesis 6 account, it was every thought was evil continually, and it was just a world of violence. Okay. It had to be that extreme before God stepped in
mm,
judgment. Um, you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham and God get into this debate, this argument, um, about should it be judged or not? And Abraham keeps saying, if there's this many people there, right? If there's just this little bit of goodness,
there's a
can we
remnant,
save it?
right?
And God's like, yeah, sure.
I'd love it. I'd love to.
Exactly. Right. And Abraham keeps lowering his standard and lowering his standard until really the ultimate story is there was nobody there. There was no goodness left. And
Mm,
so then God's like, that life I lent you, that's supposed to be for good. It's supposed to be for bringing good to other people and bringing good on this planet. And I want it back.
yeah.
Okay. You're actually destroying other people.
Mm,
Um, so the examples are extreme, and the Canaanite example is very extreme. And I won't go into it here because I'm actually going to be uh, speaking on this at some point over the next few weeks. I don't have the outline nailed down perfectly, but there's really interesting stuff about the Canaanite story that I think when we understand what was actually happening, um, we might be okay with how God handled it, right?
mm,
It was actually a very merciful, kind thing, not a genocidal thing at
right.
all. Um, so, um, why did he murder those people? I'd say he didn't, and he couldn't murder. He couldn't because of his position. It's impossible for God to murder his creation, right?
Right.
Um, but also, it's not just impossible logically. It's impossible character wise.
Mm,
God does not have that in him. Um, but he is still good.
he is still
He is
good.
still just,
Yeah.
still holy, and that requires him to step in sometimes,
Yeah.
right? By the way, we all we all demand that God steps in, but when he steps in, we all recoil and say, that's not fair. That was too
Right.
harsh, right? We all have that in us. Here's a statement I've just throw out there. Every criminal feels the judgment is unfair.
Mm,
We are the criminals.
yeah.
We will never look at God's judgment and say, yeah, you nailed that one. We will always feel it's unfair because we're on the other side of it, right?
Right.
Um, and so feeling that tension and feeling at times that it's unfair is totally human, and it's totally some of the feelings that we'd be expected to have when we read the Bible.
Mm,
Just understand that all of those uncomfortable feelings are dealt with through Jesus.
mm,
And that's why in the Old Testament, it's always pointed forward to what God was going to do to resolve all of the tension,
of
right?
course. That's
Right? Does that
fascinating.
answer that one?
I think so. Um,
Anything I missed?
I have just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
I think this kind of question I think it could be adjacent to the question of, well, if God is so good, why does he send people to hell? Why does there have to be this judgment like that? And well, we see with this, well, in the situations of like the flood, or with the Canaanites, that these people made their decision. They made their decision to live lawlessly and violently, and every thought. Um, and well, God could see that they made their choice. They made their choice, and being tolerant in that choice, he would say, "All right, if that's what you choose, I'm not gonna stop you, but I am gonna stop you on this earth. I'll take back the machete. But if you don't want me so much, then you can have that.
And that, in a sense, is an act of mercy.
It is an act
But
of mercy.
right,
Yeah.
letting people have the consequences for their choices. That is God being good and letting us be free beings, right? And
Yeah.
um, the consequences are not good, but they're self-induced consequences.
Yeah.
It's not on God's hands.
Yeah. Next question we have here. If God created everything, then doesn't that mean that he created sin? Um, I think what we've started to allude to some of these themes, some of these topics so far, and I think from my well, I might have a very brief answer. My brief answer would be no. He did not create sin. Uh, Sin is our choice. God has given us this machete. It is then our choice to use uh, this machete. I'm going back to Greg's example, the example given in the beginning of Genesis. Adam and Eve are given a choice. How do they want to live? Do they want to live with God in this perfect harmony, letting God choose what is right and what is wrong, and trusting God's decision on that? Or do Adam and Eve choose to decide what right and wrong is for themselves? And we see in Genesis that they do. They do make that choice. They choose to eat the fruit. They choose, I know what's right and what's wrong, and I can make those decisions. Uh, but in that, we are not God. And often our choices for how we should rule the world in our own power is evil and corrupt. And that comes from our decision. And because of that decision, people are hurt and there is corruption, and the cycle continues of sadness and pain because often our decision on how and what is right is not correct. So no, I don't believe that God created sin. I believe that through us deciding how we live and what is right and wrong for ourselves, we choose and we miss the mark. We cannot be perfect in our decision. Uh, Greg, I've gone on a little ramble, but
That's awesome. No, excellent. The one thing I would add that goes totally right in agreement with what you're saying is that no, God did not create sin, but he did create the potential for sin.
Mm, of
And
course.
so the the you cannot have a intelligent being without the potential for sin.
Mm,
Any being that makes choices can make right ones and make wrong ones.
mm,
And so nobody nobody has a problem with having children, or not, most people don't.
right.
But when you do that, you produce the potential of lots of good
Yeah.
and a Hitler. Do you know what I mean? Like
Oh no.
right? The potential is there whenever a being that is free comes into existence. There is the potential for great good and the potential for great evil.
Mm,
Um, so when God created free beings that could both choose to love him, choose to follow him, choose to let him define what is right and wrong, as you just described in a great way, um, but could also choose to define right and wrong for themselves, could choose to say, hey, God, I'm not going to follow you. When God created beings like that are actually relational, that you can actually be friends with, right? Because you can't be friends with someone or something that that has no choice,
no.
right? That you can have an illusion of friendship, but you can't have the real thing, right?
Yeah.
And so by God creating beings that he would love and could love him in return, the potential for sin came into existence, but not sin itself. Sin
Mm,
itself came into existence when those free beings decided, God, I want you out of the world you made. Have a nice day.
right.
That's when that's when sin started. And that same feeling comes inside of us. Like,
Yeah.
God, get out of this life you gave me.
Mm,
Have a nice day. That that is always the root of sin,
right.
right? Um, and so we create that. What God creates is
Yeah.
the remedy for sin. God makes it possible for free beings who are sinful to be forgiven of their sins, delivered from their sins, and live in an eternity apart from sin in a loving relationship. So,
Mm,
so God is always, always against sin
yeah.
and against the separation that it brings, both physical death, spiritual death, all that. God's always the rescuer in the story. We like to paint him as the villain, right? But that's
Yeah.
not how the story reads, right? He's the hero, he's the deliverer. And when we see that, man, it changes everything.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
Yeah.
incredible. Yeah, it's fascinating. Sometimes, well, when discussing it, like you said, we can paint God as the villain. Why would he choose to make things this way? Yes, we could have a free choice. Why would he do this? But he also did create the remedy. Uh, and what an incredible loving God to, even though we mess up, um, when we mess up, that he extends his forgiveness to us if we choose to accept it. And my hope is that everybody would understand this and that they would choose to accept this incredible forgiveness that God has offered. Um, that is possible because of Jesus Christ. I really hope that. Um, but yes. And then the last question that we have kind of part with this, and we've talked about it a little bit, so we might give an overview or a review of what we talked about in response to it. Didn't God break his own commandments by killing people? And I assume by commandments, the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. Um, Now we had talked about God and did God murder those people? We talked about how because of God's character, he cannot murder. So he would not have broken this commandment because of his character. Um, Greg, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, but just a small little thing. It probably um, some of this confusion actually comes back to a translation issue. Probably um, when I've heard this before, like usually it goes back to hearing the Ten Commandments and it's thou shalt not kill.
Mm,
Now, if you read a more modern translation, it's going to say thou shalt not commit murder, right? Like,
mm,
because that's what the original word, like, and that's the context. That's what it means. In the King James, it says thou shalt not kill. So that is the common, uh, because many people grew up reading the King James, that there's this idea that killing is always 100% wrong, and that's just not reality. That's not true. That's not what the Bible teaches. And so um, the command was thou shalt not murder, or you should never be so overcome with selfishness
mm,
that you rob from somebody their life that was not given to them by you, it was given to them by God.
mm.
So nobody has the right to take that from another human being in a selfish motive like that.
Never.
So that is what is being commanded that we shouldn't do. And God has never committed murder. He cannot ever commit murder. Um, has he made people's physical life here on earth come to an end as an act of mercy and protection of others, or dealing with the consequences of people's sin? Yes. But even that
Mm,
is rare.
Right.
Even that is very rare. Like over the thousands of years of human history, you can only find a handful of times. And they were very extreme situations. And when he did that, it was to protect human society to get us to the point of Jesus. Like
Mm,
if he hadn't stepped in Genesis 6 when there was just complete mass warfare, if you will, right? Like people could have gone extinct,
right.
right? Like God had to intervene, right?
Right.
Anyway, so no, he did not commit uh, something wrong. He did not commit murder.
Mm, very cool. Well, I hope that this has been a beneficial beneficial experience for you to listen to and to kind of ponder. Um, and I think just a comment that I would have for you as a viewer, go back and read the text, read the events that take place in the Bible. Read, if you can, well, all of it. Get the full picture, um, and see who God is through those events. I think by going through and understanding the context of the situations, I think that can be very beneficial. Um, but do it, read it. I think you'd learn quite a bit. Um, Greg, do you have any final thoughts, any final comments before I wrap up?
Something totally unrelated. I have somebody at the door, so I'm,
Oh,
I'm going to have to
have to leave.
actually
All
go
right.
to the
Well,
door.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more of our discussions and our almost answers, please hit the subscribe button. But we can't wait to answer more of your questions. Please send them to us. And yes, I am Matt, and this is Greg, and this has been Questions and Almost Answers. All right, go answer your door.